Hi everyone, this is our first video lecture, and this first week we'll be talking about the very first inhabitants of the Americas. Alright, so some of you may have heard the term Beringia before. Beringia is what you can see, let's get the mouse. So this border, this light tan color. Beringia was this entire landmass when it was exposed. So this was about, between 16,000 and 11,000 years ago. We start having people who move from this area and start traveling. This land, keep in mind, this was land. So today this is water. So they traveled across, eventually reaching the Americas. So the arrival to the Americas somewhere, around 15,000 years ago or so is when it started. Compare that with the arrival of Europeans, so that would be about 525 years ago, maybe a little bit more. And, that means that most of American history is Native American history. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to talk about that history. We also don't have a lot of sources, so we don't have the same sort of artifacts and documents left over from the Native population that we do have from the Europeans that end up coming over. But this migration, came from Siberia, across Beringia, and then into North America. So we do have people that started coming over. Now, some people, there are some new theories, so that's the dominant theory. Some people argue that perhaps people migrated by boat. So traveling along the coastline, hunting fish, hunting whales, hunting seals. And so while we're not quite sure if they traveled by land or by sea or by both, they did make it over. We all know that. So these different migration theories also are reflected in different oral traditions, different storytelling of these groups. So having ancestral stories about people traveling the Great Salt Sea to make it to their current home and things like that leads us to believe that that may have been traveling by boat may have been a common way to come over. All right. So these first people who arrived over 15,000 years ago, and they found and hunted huge megafauna. And megafauna would be like this creature here, the mammoth, but also things like giant bison, giant sloths, so sloths like larger than a giraffe, camels, and lions, saber-toothed tigers. And so over the years, they spread over the Americas following these different megafauna. And then eventually we had the end of the Ice Age. And when the Ice Age ended and ice started melting, that meant there was more water. That meant that eventually Beringia became covered up by water, and we have changing ecosystems. And so when that starts happening, humans start dominating the landscape because there's a lot more water, and they start overhunting. And so the combination of this climate change and the overhunting of the megafauna means that the megafauna went extinct. All right. So as you can see here, between 10,000 and 2,500 years ago is when we have distinct cultures start forming. So this is because people ended up settling in specific areas, and in those specific areas, they have different resources available to them. Mountains, water, desert. So different climates, they start specializing in different tools, and so we have these different groups really start becoming distinct from one another. Here is one of the earliest known cultures. This is the Paleo-Indians, and yes, there's a popular diet now based off of these people. And so this is the earliest known distinct culture, around 11,000 BCE. And these people started settling on the continent after the ice sheets melted, started retreating. They were nomads, meaning they followed animals, they followed seasonal plants. And one thing we have left behind that's a distinct item from the Paleo-Indians is this Clovis Point that you see there on the left. This is the most distinct artifact of this area. And you may have guessed it is for spear tips. That's what those are. Okay, so around 8000 BCE, society started changing. So when these megafauna went extinct, it was also around the time when different economies started specializing, and so we start having the very, very distinct different groups throughout North America. And so we're going to get into some of those, some of the major areas. The first group, or cluster, that we're going to talk about is Mesoamerica. And so this is ancient Mexico. And so in Mesoamerica, one of the reasons why they're one of the most important groups here is that they are responsible for plant domestication. And this is about 10,000 years ago. So they really are the founders of agriculture in the Americas. So some of their standard crops were squash, maize, also known as corn, beans, and peppers. Those were some of their main crops. They had an agricultural revolution. So because they started farming, this led to an increased population, which then led to urban settlements. And people could start specializing in professions or in crafts that were not growing their own food for survival. So we start having, artisans, religious leaders, warriors, people that have a specific job, because there are many people who are already devoted to the growing of food, and we don't need everyone doing that. Okay, so some of these notable groups, we have the Olmecs. The Olmecs were the first city builders in Mesoamerica. They built large plazas, pyramids, those giant basalt heads that you may have seen, especially if you ever watched the show Legends of the Hidden Temple. You'll know that there's a giant talking stone head named Olmec, and that's a reference to the Olmec group here. One major city that was either built by the Olmecs or built by a later group who was styling in an Olmec fashion, there's some debate about that, was Teotihuacan. And in 650 CE, it was about 10 square miles, and the population of Teotihuacan was 250,000 people. And just to kind of get an idea of 250,000 people, that's roughly the size of Modesto right now. So it was a pretty large city. We also have the Mayans. And so the Mayans, they had cities with palaces, with aqueducts, baths, temples, observatories, a very high-tech society. They had a written language, as you see there on the right. That's part of the Dresden Codex. They discovered the zero. So if any of you are super into math, that might sound exciting. And they had about 50 urban centers at their peak. So several large cities. They also had an accurate calendar that you may have heard of, the Mayan calendar, still being talked about. All right. By about 900 CE, both of those two societies had gone into a decline of their own, basically from different wars, and then some lack of resources following the wars. And the Aztecs came into play around 1200, and they settled in central Mexico. At the end of the 1400s, their empire was pretty large. In their largest city, they had about 250,000 people, again, about the size of Modesto, and that was at their capital of Tenochtitlan. They also had palaces, temples, gardens, and they had several marketplaces. And in these marketplaces, they had goods from their various subjugated lands. So subjugation is one of your universal concepts, and that is when a powerful group sort of dominates another neighboring group and forces them to become part of their empire. So something that you may have heard the Romans did a lot of, the Aztecs certainly did a lot of subjugating. And so at these marketplaces, in these different neighboring communities that they've brought into the Aztec Empire, they have goods at their marketplaces from all those different areas. They were powerful. There was a lot of wealth in the Aztec Empire. technology and art. You know, it's a very complex society. And it was also highly stratified. And stratification is another one of those universal concepts, which means that society was broken into groups based on class. So an upper class, a middle class, a lower class. Typically, the rulers and aristocrats, you know, those at the top would be involved in things like religion, politics, and war, somewhat similar to today. Commoners, people in that middle class, would be performing manual labor, so farming and crafting and artisans. And then the lowest rung on that hierarchy would be people who were enslaved. And so there were plenty of enslaved people in the Aztec Empire. Okay. We also have the Southwest. And so the Southwest, they learned farming techniques from Mesoamerica around 2100 BCE, but didn't fully adopt agriculture until about 2,000 years later. Two of the big groups in this area are the Mogollon and the Hohokam, and they lived in New Mexico and South Arizona, and they thrived between 0 and 1,000 at the current era. And so some things they're known for building most of their dwellings near water sources, because in this like desert environment, they needed to be as close to water as possible. And because of that, they also became very good at irrigation. And the Hohokams in particular constructed this super complex irrigation system in Arizona, which supported one of the largest pre-contact populations, as you see there. And can't remember which city it is, but one of the one of the main cities in Arizona, and I don't think it's Phoenix, but their current irrigation system is just superimposed onto the Hohokam one. So still a good plan. The Anasazi as well were in this area. They're also known as the Ancestral Pueblo people. And they had a complex society as well because of their irrigation techniques led to crop surplus, which led to a population boom. And so we start having people that can do things like perfect masonry and build these complex cities like you see here in this photo. So this is Mesa Verde, which you can go visit. It's still there. Some of you may have done so. And you can see that they're quite good at building these brick towns on the cliffside, which is really cool. They also, you know, they had religious shrines, observatories. They were very good at basket making and other artwork as well. And their peak was about 900 to 1100 of the current era. And they had about 30,000 people that were spread out over 50,000 square miles. So a lower population density than the Mayans or the Aztecs, but considering they were in the desert, still pretty impressive. So we're going to pause here. This video service only allows me to do 15-minute chunks at a time, and we're currently at 13 minutes. So we'll have a part 2 to this one, so stretch, you know, go get a coffee refill, whatever you got to do, and come back to part 2, where we will finish up with our native groups in the Americas.